Act 1. Storm on the horizon. The barn doors stood open to the cool hush of early morning, the sky just beginning to lighten with the promise of another scorching day. The scent of fresh hay and horseflesh mingled with the crisp air, and dust motes danced lazily in the shafts of sunlight filtering through the high rafters. Inside the spacious barn, Tessa McGraw moved with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew her way around horses. She crouched near a young filly, her voice low and coaxing, a gentle whisper of reassurance against the early hush of dawn. "Easy now, girl. Ain't no one here gonna hurt you." The filly, a chestnut with a white blaze streaking down its delicate face, flicked its ears at her voice but didn't move away. Progress. Tessa exhaled slowly, offering the back of her hand in greeting. The filly hesitated, nostrils flaring, then took a tentative step closer. A slow smile spread across Tessa's lips. She had spent weeks working with this one, teaching her to trust, to accept the touch of human hands, and now she was finally making a breakthrough. A scuff of boots against the packed dirt sent the filly skittering sideways, its brief moment of trust vanishing like morning dew. Tessa clenched her jaw and turned, already knowing who she'd find looming near the barn doors. Her father, Calvin McGraw, stood with his arms crossed over his broad chest, his expression a mix of exasperation and something else, something wary. He wore the same weary scowl he always did when he caught her working the horses alone. His graying hair stuck out from beneath a well-worn hat, his square jaw set in a way that told her this would be another lecture. "Damn it, Tessa," Calvin muttered, stepping forward. "What did I tell you about fooling around with those young horses alone?" Tessa straightened to her full height, brushing off her trousers with deliberate slowness before facing him head-on. "I ain't fooling around, Pa. I'm working. That filly's coming along real nice." Calvin's gaze flicked toward the still nervous horse. "Ain't the point. That animal could have spooked and trampled you, or thrown a fit and knocked you into the fence." Tessa bit back the sharp retort on the tip of her tongue. She knew her father's warnings came from a place of concern, but his overprotectiveness gnawed at her like a burr under the saddle. "I've been around horses my whole life. I know how to handle myself." Calvin sighed, shaking his head. "You're your mother's daughter, all right. Stubborn as a mule and just as reckless." Tessa's breath hitched at the mention of her mother. It wasn't often Calvin spoke of her, and when he did, it was always with that distant sadness in his eyes. Softening her stance, she moved toward the filly again, speaking as much for herself as for her father. "I just want to help, Pa, to be useful." Calvin watched her in silence, his mouth pressing into a thin line. Whatever he might have said next was lost when the sound of thundering boots echoed down the barn aisle. A ranch hand, Will Harper, skidded to a stop just inside the doorway, his face red and slick with sweat. "Mr. McGraw, Miss Tessa, we got trouble." Tessa stiffened. "What kind of trouble?" Will sucked in a gulp of air, his hands braced against his knees. "Rustlers, I reckon. A good portion of the herd's gone. Must been taken sometime last night." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick with disbelief. Then Calvin cursed under his breath, already moving toward the house. "Get the men together," he barked at Will. "Saddle up. We ride out within the hour." Tessa's pulse pounded as she met her father's gaze, already knowing what was coming next. "You ain't coming," Calvin said firmly. Her temper flared hot. "The hell I ain't. Those are our horses, Pa. If you think I'm just gonna sit here and you'll do as I say, Tessa." The words struck like a whip. Her father's authority had always been absolute on the ranch, but that didn't mean she had to like it. Calvin turned away, already shouting orders to the hands as he stomped off toward the house. The matter, as far as he was concerned, was settled. Tessa clenched her fists at her sides, her heart hammering. The stolen horses weren't just livestock. They were her future, her way of proving to her father and to herself that she belonged here, that she was capable of more than just tending the homestead. Her gaze strayed back to the filly, still watching her with wary eyes. She would not be left behind. Not this time. A storm was coming, and if her father thought he could keep her out of it, he had another thing coming. The corral stood strangely silent, the usual chorus of snorting horses and the rhythmic thud of hooves absent from the morning air. The dust in the enclosure had settled, leaving only a few deep hoofprints and a set of wagon wheel ruts leading toward the horizon. The heavy wooden gate, normally secured tight with iron latches, hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Tessa McGraw stood at the edge of the corral, her heart hammering in her chest as her eyes swept the empty enclosure. This place, which had always pulsed with life colts prancing, mares watching with calm wisdom, stallions stamping impatiently, was now nothing but a hollow shell. It didn't seem real. A knot of ranch hands clustered nearby, murmuring in low voices, their hats clutched in anxious hands. Will Harper, the same ranch hand who'd come running earlier, scuffed a boot against the dirt. Tracks lead southeast, he said, his voice tight. Looks like they had a couple wagons with him. Must been moving fast. Tessa's fists clenched at her sides. Rustlers, she ground out, tasting the word like dust on her tongue. They stole him right out from under our noses. Calvin McGraw stood a few feet away, his face like weathered stone, his grey eyes scanning the evidence with a hardened expression. He took his hat off and ran a hand through his greying hair. "We'll get him back," he said, his voice rough with barely contained fury. "But we ain't rushing off without a plan." Tessa turned on him, anger rising like wildfire. "We can't just stand here, Pa. Every minute we waste, they get farther away." Calvin's gaze snapped to her, his mouth tightening. "And what exactly do you think you'll do, girl? Ride after a pack of thieves, guns blazing? They'd put a bullet in you soon as look at you." Tessa's jaw clenched. "I can track just as well as any of the men. You know that." Calvin's lips pressed into a thin line. "That ain't the point, and you know it." But it was the point. That was exactly the point. He didn't think she was capable, or maybe he did, but refused to admit it. He still saw her as his little girl, no matter how many times she proved herself in the saddle, no matter how many times she outworked the men on the ranch. Tessa took a steadying breath, struggling to keep her frustration in check. "They took our best horses, Pa. We can't afford to lose them. I should be out there helping to get him back." Calvin exhaled sharply, turning back toward the tracks, avoiding her gaze. "We'll send men out, but we ain't ridden blind. Word is there's a ranger in town, come to look into thefts like this. We'll wait on him." Tessa stiffened. "Wait? You want to wait for some stranger when we already have a lead?" Calvin looked at her then, his expression unreadable. "We don't know what we're ridden into, Tessa. These ain't just no-good horse thieves, we're talking rustlers who had a plan. Maybe even outlaws." Tessa knew he was right. She saw the tracks, the way the rustlers had worked efficiently, moving the herd without leaving behind a single panicked, wandering horse. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment theft. They knew what they were doing, but waiting, that sat bitter in her stomach. Frustration curling tight in her chest, she turned away from her father, her gaze sweeping over the corral once more. Near the fence, a lone mare stood, shifting nervously, the only one left behind. Tessa's breath caught. It was Sunflower, a Palomino mare she'd raised from a foal, the one she'd planned to break fully this summer. The rustlers had taken everything but left her behind, whether by accident or design. Tessa didn't know, but something about it made her gut twist. Slowly she walked to the mare, reaching out a hand to run down her golden neck. The horse's breath came fast, still spooked from the night's events. Tessa leaned in close, whispering against Sunflower's ear, the promise forming without thought. "I'll bring him home," she murmured, fingers curling around the bridle still dangling from the mare's head. Sunflower flicked her ears but didn't pull away. Tessa swallowed hard. No matter what her father said, no matter what this ranger thought he could do, she wasn't about to sit back and let someone else take charge of finding her horses. One way or another, she was going after them. The town of Greenbrush shimmered under the midday sun, heat waves curling above the dusty street like ghostly fingers. The wooden storefronts, their paint faded and peeling, stood stubbornly against the endless stretch of dry Texas land beyond. Horses dozed in the shade of the hitching posts, their tails flicking lazily against flies. A few women in bonnets bustled toward the mercantile, baskets hooked over their arms, their voices a low murmur of gossip. Grayson Tate rode in slow, his dark gelding kicking up little puffs of dust with each step. His eyes, sharp and assessing, swept over the town as he passed through. A couple of men standing outside the saloon paused their conversation to watch him, their expressions wary. A man riding in alone, especially a stranger, always drew notice. He was used to it. He reined in his horse near the Greenbrush General Store, swung down from the saddle, and tied the reins to the post. Adjusting his hat to block the worst of the sun, he gave a passing nod to a wiry old man sitting in a rocking chair on the porch. The man spat into the dirt, squinting up at him with dreamy eyes. "You look like trouble," the old-timer muttered, his voice sandpaper rough. Grayson smirked. "More like the kind that stops trouble." He stepped into the mercantile, the heavy wooden door creaking as he entered. The air inside was cooler, carrying the scents of coffee beans, leather, and fresh-cut tobacco. Rows of shelves lined the space, stacked with canned goods, bolts of fabric, and sacks of flour. Behind the wooden counter, Elijah Parsons, the shopkeeper, looked up from tallying figures in a ledger. Parsons was a thick-bodied man with a grizzled beard and sharp, calculating eyes. He took in Grayson's dust-covered duster, the well-worn revolver holstered low on his hip, and finally the gleam of his Texas Ranger badge pinned discreetly to his belt. "Afternoon," Parsons greeted, his voice careful. "What can I do for you?" Grayson removed his hat, running a hand through his dark, sweat-damp hair before setting the Stetson on the counter. "Looking for information." Parsons let out a slow breath, setting down his pencil. "I figured as much." Grayson glanced around. A couple of customers lingered near the back, pretending to browse but undoubtedly listening. He leaned against the counter, keeping his voice casual. "Heard about some horse thefts happening around here. Any chance you can tell me where I might start looking?" Parsons scratched his beard, considering. "Mighty bold thieves, I'll say that much. Ain't just Greenbrush either. Been happening all along this stretch of land, ranches hit, livestock taken, and not a trace left behind." Grayson rolled his shoulders, the tension creeping in. He knew the pattern. Rustlers who worked clean and fast weren't just desperate men looking for a few extra dollars, they were organized. Dangerous. Parsons lowered his voice. "Heard some folks saying Bart Crowley's behind it." Grayson's hand tightened slightly on the counter. The name hit like the sharp edge of a blade, slicing through memories he'd rather keep buried. Crowley. It had been a long time since he'd heard that name, but it wasn't a name easily forgotten. If the rumors were true, if Crowley was running a horse-stealing ring, then this was far bigger than just a few desperate men looking to make a quick trade at auction. "Anyone seen him?" Grayson asked, keeping his voice even. Parsons shook his head. "No one knows for sure, just whispers. That's the trouble with Crowley, he don't leave a trail." Grayson exhaled slowly, jaw tightening. He'd heard the same kind of whispers before, in another town, another case, one that had ended in blood. A flash of memory surged up, gunfire in the dark, a woman screaming, the acrid scent of burnt gunpowder. A hostage situation that had gone south. A mistake that still haunted him. He forced the thoughts down, locking them away. This was different. It had to be. Parsons studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward the saloon across the street. "If you're looking for more talk, I'd check in with Clive Turner. He runs with the cowhands round here. He hears a lot more than I do." Grayson gave a short nod, picking up his hat, much obliged. As he turned to leave, Parsons called out, "Be careful, Ranger. Greenbrush is a peaceful town for now. But if Crowley's got a hand in this, it won't stay that way for long." Grayson stepped back out into the heat, jamming his hat low over his brow. He could feel the weight of the past pressing against him, like a storm rolling in on the horizon. He'd come here for information, What he'd found instead was an old enemy, and if Crowley was behind these thefts, then Greenbrush was about to become anything but peaceful. The saloon's porch groaned under the shifting weight of two men settled in rocking chairs, their boots scuffing against the sun-bleached boards. A wooden sign overhead swayed slightly in the breeze, its chains rattling as it caught the movement. Across the street, dust swirled in lazy eddies, kicked up by the hooves of a passing wagon. Grayson Tate stepped through the barring doors, jaw set, his mind sifting through the scraps of information he'd pried from Clive Turner inside. Not much, just more speculation, guesses, and vague warnings. No one in this town liked to talk, especially to a ranger. He adjusted the brim of his hat, shielding his eyes from the blinding afternoon sun. The Texas heat baked the planks under his boots, thickening the air with the scent of stale beer and horses. He barely had time to step forward before someone collided with him. The impact sent a jolt through his frame. Instinctively, he reached out, steadying the other person before they could topple backward. "Hell's bells," a woman snapped, jerking out of his grasp. "Do you not watch where you're going?" Grayson took a step back, assessing her with cool scrutiny. She was young, early 20s, maybe with an angular face bronzed by the sun and a blaze of determination in her hazel eyes. Her auburn hair had mostly come loose from whatever had been holding it back, stray strands clinging to her damp forehead. His eyes flicked down to the dust-streaked riding skirt she wore, practical, but well-worn, and the set of her shoulders, squared as if she were ready for a fight. "You're the one who ran into me, ma'am," he said evenly. She planted her hands on her hips. "That right? Or did you just decide to block the doorway like some overgrown fence post?" A slow smirk threatened to tug at the corner of his mouth, but he kept his expression neutral. "Either way, seems you're in a hurry." Tessa McGraw let out an exasperated breath, swiping at the hair sticking to her cheek. "Damn right I am." She pointed a gloved hand at him, as if accusing him of something worse than obstructing her path. "Are you the Texas Ranger I've been hearing about?" Grayson gave a slow nod. Grayson Tate. Tessa crossed her arms, weight shifting from one foot to the other. "Good, that means you're the man I need." He raised a brow. "That's so." Her frustration flared hotter. "My family's herd was stolen last night, and while my pair's more inclined to sit around and wait for you to do your job, I'm not about to waste time. We need to get after those rustlers now." Grayson had spent enough years dealing with impatient ranchers to recognize the fire in her tone. But urgency didn't change facts, and he wasn't about to gallop off half-cocked because one determined young woman thought she could bark orders at him. "I don't ride blind," he said, voice calm but firm. "These men aren't just common thieves. If your herd's gone, they knew exactly what they were doing. That means we don't rush in without a plan." Tessa's eyes flared. "You don't ride blind, huh? Well, you're sure tacking your sweet time about it." A low chuckle came from one of the men on the porch, though neither Grayson nor Tessa paid him any mind. Grayson set his hat lower over his brow. "Rushing gets people killed." The words landed with weight, something dark shifting in his gaze. For the first time since the collision, Tessa hesitated, her fingers twitching at her sides, as if she wanted to argue but sensed something deeper in his words. Grayson held her gaze a second longer before glancing toward the street. "Tell me everything you know about the theft. Tracks, numbers, direction. If we go after them, we do it smart." Tessa let out a breath, clearly reluctant to back down. But she had no choice. This was the best lead she had. "Fine," she said, rolling her shoulders back. "But if you think I'm letting you ride out without me, you've got another thing coming." Grayson's lips quirked, just for a second. He had a feeling she'd be trouble. And yet, something told him he might just need that kind of trouble. The saloon stank of cheap whiskey and old sweat, the air thick with pipe smoke that curled in lazy ribbons toward the rafters. The long wooden bar was scarred from years of rowdy brawls and careless knife work, and a few dusty ranchers hunched over their drinks, eyes shifting toward the door as Tessa McGraw and Grayson Tate stepped inside. Grayson moved with an unhurried confidence, his gaze sweeping the dimly lit room. He wasn't a man who needed to announce himself. His presence alone was enough to send a hush through the closest table. The men gathered there weren't outlaws, not the real kind, but they'd seen enough trouble to recognize it when it walked through the door. Tessa kept pace beside him, resisting the urge to fidget. She didn't frequent saloons, and even though she held her chin high, she felt the weight of too many curious stares. The place smelled of old wood, smoke, and bad decisions, and she wasn't particularly fond of any of them. Grayson strode toward the bar, where a stocky bartender polished a glass with a rag that looked dirtier than the surface he was trying to clean. "Whiskey," the man offered without looking up. "Information," Grayson corrected. The bartender's eyes flicked toward the ranger's badge. "I can't say I got much of that for sale." Grayson set his gloved hands on the bar, fingers drumming once against the wood. "I think you do. Word is someone came through here a few nights ago, paying in gold for horses that weren't his to sell." The bartender kept his expression neutral. "Lot of men come through here. Some of them carry gold." Tessa narrowed her eyes, studying him. He wasn't lying outright, but he wasn't exactly eager to help, either. She leaned against the bar, flashing the easy smile she used on jittery colts. "Come on now. What's the harm in telling us what you already know? We're just looking for some lost livestock." "No law against talking." The bartender let out a breath, as if considering. "Might be that a fella was here. Might be he wasn't. But if I was to say anything, I'd reckon that whoever he was, he had a few too many and started talking about heading south." Grayson's jaw tightened. "South?" The bartender nodded. "Toward the border, if I had to guess." Tessa looked at Grayson, her pulse kicking up. "You think it's Crowley?" Grayson didn't answer right away. He turned, scanning the saloon. A few men hunched over their drinks, deliberately avoiding his gaze. But one man, a lean fellow with a hat pulled low, was watching too closely, his knuckles white against his glass. Grayson moved in. "You know something?" The man hesitated, then took a slow sip of his drink, measuring his words. "Depends. What's it worth?" Grayson didn't flinch. "A warm bed and a meal in a jail cell, instead of a dirt grave, if you play this wrong." Tessa almost felt bad for the man. Almost. The fellow's throat bobbed. "Fine. I heard talk of a man dropping Crowley's name. Paid his tab in gold, and left without saying much else." Grayson's expression didn't change, but Tessa had been watching him closely enough to see the way his shoulders tensed. "You catch where he was headed?" The man hesitated. "Didn't say, but he had a saddlebag full of supplies, enough to last a long ride. South, toward the border. A man who didn't want to be found." Grayson gave a sharp nod. "Appreciate it." He turned, ready to leave, but Tessa lingered. Something about all this sat wrong with her, like a stone in her boot. She looked at the bartender. "What else ain't you telling us?" The bartender hesitated before shrugging. "Only that you don't want to be tangling with Crowley if you can help it." Grayson touched the brim of his hat. "That ain't up to me." They stepped outside, the afternoon sun stark against the dim saloon. Tessa took a deep breath, trying to shake off the stale whiskey and unease. She glanced sideways at Grayson, who was already flipping through the small notebook he carried, making notes on what they'd learned. "Thanks," she said, the word coming out grudgingly. Grayson didn't look up. "For what?" "For listening. For not talking to me like I don't know what I'm doing." He did glance at her then, one brow lifting slightly. "You don't seem the type to put up with that kind of talk." She smirked. "I ain't." A long pause stretched between them, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable so much as it was expectant. Grayson slid his notebook into his coat pocket. "Looks like we're riding south." Tessa nodded. "Looks like we are." Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that they didn't trust each other yet, but for now, they needed each other. And whether they liked it or not, this uneasy alliance was just beginning. The sky burned with the last embers of daylight, streaks of crimson and gold fading into the deep purple of approaching night. The McGraw Ranch sat in hushed anticipation, the air thick with the scent of dust and horse sweat. The corral, normally lively with stamping hooves and snorting horses, held an eerie stillness. It was too empty, too quiet. Tessa McGraw strode across the yard, her boots kicking up dry earth as she made a beeline for the house. She hadn't even reached the porch before Calvin McGraw stepped out, his expression as unyielding as the land they lived on. He was waiting for her. "You've got a real bad habit of running off without so much as a word," Calvin said, his voice edged with frustration. Tessa stopped at the base of the steps, lifting her chin. "I had business in town." "Business," he repeated, crossing his arms. His gaze hardened. "That business wouldn't have anything to do with a certain Texas Ranger, would it?" Tessa clenched her jaw, her hands tightening at her sides. "If you already know, why are you asking?" Calvin let out a heavy sigh, his face lined with exhaustion. "Damn it, Tessa. Do you have any idea how dangerous this is? You don't go riding off with strangers, especially not lawmen with a reputation for chasing trouble." "He ain't a stranger," she countered. "And he ain't chasing trouble. He's here to stop it." Calvin took a step down, his voice lowering. "That's what worries me." She understood what he wasn't saying. He was scared. Scared for her. Scared for the ranch. Scared of what this theft meant for everything they'd built. But Tessa wasn't a child. And she wasn't about to stand by while someone else fought their battle. "I can help him, Pa." Calvin shook his head. "This ain't your fight." Tessa's pulse pounded. "It is my fight. Those horses ain't just livestock, they're ours. Every single one of them means something to this ranch, and I won't sit here twiddling my thumbs while someone else goes after them. I know those horses better than anyone. You need me out there." Calvin's gaze didn't waver. "I need you here." Tessa swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "Pa, if we lose that herd, we might never recover. You know that as well as I do. And Grayson needs someone who understands those animals, how they think, how they move. I can track him better than any hired hand you send." A muscle ticked in Calvin's jaw. He looked away, rubbing a hand over his face, as if trying to gather his thoughts. Tessa stood her ground, waiting. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, rough around the edges. "You're just like your mother, you know that?" Tessa's throat tightened. Calvin exhaled. "You're stubborn. Got too much fire for your own good." Her lips curled into a half smile. "So I've been told." He eyed her for a long moment, then finally nodded. "You go. But you stay out of direct danger, you hear me? No taking risks, no trying to be a hero. You let the Ranger do the fighting if it comes to that." Relief surged through her, but she didn't let it show. She nodded, swallowing back the emotion clogging her throat. "I promise." A quiet cough drew both their attention. Grayson Tate stood a few paces away, his hat held in one hand, as if he'd been there longer than either of them realized. The glow of the setting sun cast sharp angles across his face, his expression unreadable. Tessa squared her shoulders. "We leave at dawn." Grayson studied her, something unreadable passing through his eyes. Then he gave a slow nod. "Dawn it is." Calvin shot Grayson a warning look. "You bring her back in one piece." Grayson met the older man's gaze head-on. "You have my word." The deal was struck. As Tessa turned back toward the house, she caught a hint of something in Grayson's expression, something almost like admiration. Maybe, just maybe, this uneasy alliance wouldn't be so bad after all. The first breath of morning stretched across the Texas plains, the golden glow of dawn creeping over rolling hills. The land, untouched by the bustle of the waking world, lay in quiet stillness, broken only by the soft snorts of horses and the rhythmic creak of leather saddles. Tessa McGraw adjusted her reins, keeping her mare at a steady pace beside Grayson Tate, who rode with the ease of a man used to long hours in the saddle. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the McGraw Ranch, but the silence between them wasn't quite uncomfortable. Tense, maybe. Expectant. The trail south was clear enough at first. Tracks from stolen horses had left deep impressions in the dirt. telling a story Tessa could read as easily as words on a page. The herd had been pushed hard, driven at a pace meant to put as much distance as possible between the thieves and anyone coming after them. She glanced over at Grayson. He studied the land with the same keen intensity she did, his gaze sharp beneath the brim of his hat. Every now and then, his eyes flicked toward the horizon, scanning for movement, danger. Tessa broke the silence first. "You've tracked men like this before." Grayson didn't look at her. "More times than I'd like." She waited, expecting more, but he didn't elaborate. Fine. If he wanted to keep his past close to the vest, that was his business. She turned her attention back to the tracks. The spacing told her plenty horses moving fast, but controlled. These weren't desperate outlaws scrambling for escape. They had a plan. "They're pacing the herd," she observed, "not running them ragged." Grayson nodded. "Means they're thinking long term, either planning to sell or use them for something bigger." The idea churned uneasily in her stomach. She'd assumed these men were after money, looking for a quick sale across the border. But if they were being careful, if they had plans, it meant they were dealing with something worse than a few desperate ranch hands turned rustler. A cool wind kicked up, stirring dry grass around them. Tessa let out a slow breath, watching as Grayson leaned low in his saddle, scanning the tracks with that same calm focus he'd had since they'd set out. She hated to admit it, but his skill impressed her. "What is it?" she asked. He gestured toward a set of prints near the edge of the trail. Riders on foot. More than 2, maybe 3 or 4. Tessa frowned. "So there were more of them than we thought." Grayson straightened. "Or they picked up more men along the way." That realization sat heavy between them. They rode on, their horses carrying them through miles of open country, the sun climbing higher. Time stretched between them, and slowly the tension from the morning ride began to ease. Tessa caught herself watching him now and again, studying the way he worked, how he sat his horse like he was born in the saddle, how his eyes never stopped moving, searching for anything that might be out of place. "Where'd you learn to track like that?" she asked. His jaw tensed, like he wasn't sure whether to answer. "Years of chasing outlaws." A small, wry smile tugged at her lips. "And here I thought you were just born knowing everything." He turned to her then, a flicker of amusement in his otherwise unreadable gaze. "You always talk this much on the trail, only when my company's too quiet." She swore she saw the corner of his mouth lift before he looked away. They rode on, the easy rhythm of the trail settling between them, the tension shifting into something different. Something that wasn't quite trust, but wasn't outright suspicion either. By midday, the sun had climbed high overhead, turning the river into a gleaming ribbon that cut across the dry land. The water, shallow in places, ran clear over smooth stones, its gentle babbling the only sound beyond the distant call of a hawk. Tessa's mare hesitated at the river's edge, dipping her nose toward the water. Grayson's horse shifted beside hers, ears twitching. Tessa started to urge her horse forward, then she saw them. Boot prints, not just a few, a cluster, more than she'd expected. Grayson saw them too, his posture stiffened, his fingers flexing over the reins. "They were here," she said, voice low. "More than we thought." Grayson scanned the banks, his expression unreadable. "They crossed here." "But why dismount?" Tessa studied the prints, her pulse kicking up. Something made them stop. Grayson dismounted, crouching to get a better look. The signs were clear now. Men had stood here, waiting, watching. "Could be they stopped to water the horses," she suggested. Grayson touched one of the deeper imprints, his fingers brushing the disturbed soil. Or they were meeting someone. That thought sent an uneasy shiver through her. She sat straighter in the saddle, scanning the tree line on the far bank. The leaves rustled, the wind shifting through dry brush. The land was open enough to give them a good view, but there were places for a man to hide if he knew what he was doing. Grayson stood, brushing dirt from his gloves. "We need to be careful. They might have left, but they're not far." Tessa swallowed, her grip tightening on the reins. They weren't just tracking horse thieves anymore. They were tracking men who expected to be followed. The campfire crackled in the hush of night, sending up tiny embers that drifted toward the blanket of stars overhead. The wind had died down, leaving only the distant howl of a coyote and the occasional rustling of dry brush. The firelight cast long shadows across the rocky terrain, the dancing glow warming the small patch of land where Tessa McGraw and Grayson Tate had settled for the night. Tessa stretched out her legs, her boots scuffing the dirt as she leaned back against her saddle. She took a sip of coffee from her tin cup, grimacing at the bitter bite. "This might be the worst coffee I've ever had." Grayson, seated across from her, smirked as he tore off a piece of dry biscuit. "That bad? It's like drinking charred river water." She wrinkled her nose, setting the cup aside. "If I die in my sleep, don't let my pa think it was the rustlers. Let him know it was your god-awful coffee." Grayson let out a quiet chuckle. Duly noted. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the steady pop of burning wood. The tension of the day had eased just enough for a moment of quiet, the kind that settled low in the bones, making exhaustion hit harder. Tessa picked up a biscuit and turned it over in her hands, searching for something to say that wasn't about tracking outlaws or stolen horses. "You always been a Texas Ranger." Grayson glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the shifting glow of firelight. "For a while now." "That's not an answer." He hesitated, as if weighing whether to humor her or let the question go unanswered. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Before this, I worked cattle drives, bounty hunting for a spell. Joined up with the Rangers when I figured I was better off on the right side of the law." Tessa tilted her head. "And what made you figure that?" His jaw tensed, a muscle jumping just beneath his cheekbone. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past her, toward the darkness beyond the fire's reach, as if he could see something out there that she couldn't. "There was a job," he said finally. "Went wrong." She studied him, watching the way his fingers curled around his tin cup, the way his shoulders tightened just a little. He wasn't a man who gave much away, but something in his voice carried the weight of regret. Tessa leaned forward slightly. "Wrong how?" He let out a slow breath. "It was supposed to be a simple takedown. A man wanted for robbery, couple of murders. We thought we had him holed up alone." His voice dipped, low and rough, like he'd spent years trying to scrub the memory clean. "Turned out he wasn't alone." Tessa's throat went dry. "Someone else got hurt." Grayson nodded. "Woman. She worked in the boarding house where he was hidden out. We didn't know." Bullets started flying, and before we could get her clear, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "She didn't make it." Tessa swallowed hard, the biscuit forgotten in her hands. She'd expected something bad, but not that. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time saw something beyond the hardened lawman. Guilt. A man who carried the weight of past mistakes, the kind that settled deep in the soul and never really let go. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Grayson didn't respond right away. He poked at the fire with a stick, the flames jumping higher before settling back down. "Not your fault." "No," but she hesitated. "I know what it's like to lose someone and wonder if you could have done something different." He glanced up at her then, his gaze sharper than before, like he hadn't expected her to understand. She didn't elaborate. Didn't tell him about the long, painful months after her mother died, how she'd replayed every moment leading up to it, wondering if she should have done anything to change the outcome. Some things were too personal to say out loud. A log shifted in the fire, sending up a soft hiss of sparks. Their eyes held for a beat longer than necessary, something unspoken stretching between them, thick as molasses. Tessa cleared her throat, breaking the moment. She reached for her coffee, then thought better of it. "Well," she said, forcing lightness into her tone, "that was a real cheery conversation." Grayson smirked, though there was something softer in his eyes now, something less guarded. "Yeah, I reckon it was." She reached for another biscuit, and as she did, her fingers brushed against his where they rested in the dirt. Just a small touch, but enough to send a jolt through her system, like the snap of a downed wire after a storm. She went still. So did he. For a long second, neither of them moved. Then Grayson shifted back, pulling his hand away as he stood, stretching his arms as if the touch hadn't just sent something sharp and dangerous curling low in his stomach. "Get some rest," he said, his voice steady, unreadable again. "We ride at dawn." Tessa nodded, but even as she settled into her bedroll, she knew she wouldn't be getting much sleep. Because no matter how much she wanted to pretend otherwise, that moment by the fire fleeting, unspoken had changed something, and she wasn't sure what to do about it. The prairie stretched wide under a sky of ink, the sliver of a quarter moon, offering barely enough light to see by. The land lay hushed, save for the occasional rustling of dry grass in the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. The air held the crisp scent of cooling earth, but Grayson Tate had spent too many years tracking dangerous men to let the quiet lull him into a false sense of security. Something wasn't right. He kept his horse at a steady walk, his ears tuned to the sounds around them. Tessa McGraw rode beside him, her gaze sharp as she studied the ground ahead. She hadn't spoken much since they'd left camp, but then again, neither had he. His instincts prickled. And then a gunshot split the night. The crack echoed across the plains, shattering the silence. Grayson's horse reared, nostrils flaring, but he was already moving, swinging out of the saddle and hitting the dirt as another shot rang out. He rolled, hand going for his revolver, eyes searching the darkness. "Tessa, down!" He barely caught sight of her before she flung herself from the saddle, hitting the ground hard and scrambling for cover behind a fallen log. Her mare bolted, hooves pounding as it vanished into the night. More gunfire. The sharp, unmistakable ping of bullets striking wood. Grayson crouched low, his back pressed against a rock outcropping, his breath measured. He fired into the shadows, aiming for the muzzle flashes that gave away their attackers' positions. Tessa's voice cut through the din. "3 of them, no 4. Up near those trees." She'd managed to keep her wits about her. "Good." He shifted, aiming toward where she'd directed, squeezing off 2 more shots. A cry of pain followed. At least one had found its mark. Another bullet tore through the air, close enough that he felt the rush of displaced air past his ear. "Tessa, stay low." "I ain't dumb, Tate," she shot back, her voice tight with adrenaline. Gunfire slowed for a beat, and Grayson used the pause to reload. He risked a glance toward Tessa's position, catching a glimpse of her crouched behind the log, her own pistol gripped tight. She was breathing hard, but her hands were steady. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting. Then, out of nowhere, a shadow lunged at her. Grayson's stomach clenched. "Tessa!" She turned just in time to meet the charge, but the man was already on her, knocking her gun from her grasp. She cried out as she was slammed back against the log, arms coming up to fend off her attacker's blows. Grayson didn't think. He moved. His feet pounded across the ground as he reached her, yanking the bandit off before he could do any real harm. They grappled, fists flying. The outlaw swung hard, landing a blow to Grayson's ribs that sent a sharp jolt of pain through his side. Grayson didn't let up. He twisted, using the man's momentum against him, driving a fist into his gut. The outlaw staggered back, but Grayson was already drawing his gun. The last thing the bandit saw was the cold gleam of a ranger's revolver before Grayson pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and the man crumpled. Chest heaving, Grayson turned and found Tessa still pressed against the log, her eyes wide, breath coming fast. They stared at each other, the fight still roaring in their blood, their bodies inches apart. The tension from the ambush hadn't faded, but something new crept in, thick as the night air. Grayson swallowed hard. His pulse thundered. She was too close. Or maybe he was. Tessa's lips parted, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. He knew the look in her eyes, fierce, wild, alive with something that went beyond fear. She tilted her chin up, just a fraction. The fire in his veins burned hotter. For a single, breath-stealing moment, the world shrank to the space between them, to the heat radiating off their skin, to the way the moonlight traced the curve of her cheek. Then, just as fast as it had sparked, reality came crashing back, a groan from one of the downed outlaws, the scent of gunpowder in the air. The fact that they were still in danger. Grayson tore his gaze away. He stood, offering her a hand. "Come on, we need to go before more of him show up." Tessa hesitated, then nodded, slipping her fingers into his. Her grip was strong. Neither of them spoke as they hurried to find the horses. But as they rode away from the skirmish, Grayson kept catching himself glancing at her. And damn it all if she wasn't looking back. The first traces of dawn stretched across the sky, staining the horizon in muted shades of lavender and rose. A light wind stirred the dry grass, carrying the scent of dust and gunpowder. The land, once wrapped in darkness, now revealed the truth that night had concealed the bodies of fallen men, the churned-up dirt where hooves had thundered, and the quiet that always came after a battle. Tessa McGraw sat on her heels beside her mare, her hands resting on her thighs to keep from trembling. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving behind an exhaustion so deep she felt it in her bones. She had survived gunfire before every rancher who worked the open range long enough did, but this had been different. This had been aimed at her. The mare let out a tired snort, its flanks rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. Tessa ran a hand down the animal's neck, whispering soothing nonsense as much for herself as for the horse. It wasn't until she glanced down that she saw the dirt smeared across her palms, her nails caked with blood that wasn't hers. Her stomach twisted. She scrubbed her hands against her trousers, but the stain remained, clinging to her skin like a brand. Behind her, Grayson Tate moved among the fallen, his expression unreadable as he searched their attackers for anything useful. He didn't speak, but she felt his eyes on her now and again, watching, noticing. She straightened, refusing to let him see how badly her fingers still shook. He approached, his hat low over his brow, the strain of the fight still evident in the way he carried himself, shoulders tense, steps careful. Without a word, he pulled a canteen from his saddle and handed it to her. She hesitated, then took it, letting the cool water wash the dryness from her throat. "Check the saddlebags," he said, his voice steady. "See if they were carrying anything worth knowing." Tessa swallowed, then nodded. The sooner they figured out who these men were, the sooner they could put more distance between themselves and whatever trouble was still coming. She stepped over one of the fallen outlaws, her boots sinking into the disturbed soil. The man had a scar running from his jaw to his ear, his face locked in an expression of frozen surprise. He hadn't expected to die tonight. She looked away, her stomach tightening as she crouched beside a worn leather saddlebag still slung over his horse's back. With careful hands, she unfastened the buckles and rifled through the contents, loose ammunition. A few coins, a knife that had seen its fair share of fights. And then her fingers brushed something odd. She pulled out a folded scrap of parchment, its edges curled from wear. As she unfolded it, the lines and markings became clear, a map. Her breath caught. Grayson stepped up beside her, his shadow long against the ground. "What is it?" Tessa smoothed the paper out on her thigh, her eyes scanning the rough sketches. "Looks like a canyon pass." She traced her finger over a set of markings, her pulse kicking up. "I've seen this before. This ridge here. That's Crowley's old hideout." Grayson crouched beside her, studying the map. His jaw tightened. "So it is Crowley." Tessa let out a slow breath. "Seems that way." They were in deeper than she'd realized. Rustling cattle was one thing, stealing entire herds and gunning down anyone who got in their way was something else entirely. She looked up at Grayson, finding his gaze already on her. "We should turn back," she said, testing him. "Tell my father what we know. Get more men." Grayson shook his head. "That's what Crowley's betting on. The more time we waste, the farther he gets." Tessa knew he was right. That didn't make it any easier to swallow. She looked down at the map again, then back at the dead men around them. She'd never hunted outlaws before, never been part of something this dangerous. But she wasn't backing down. She met Grayson's eyes, steady now. Then we ride at first light. A breeze kicked up between them, carrying the scent of sage and blood. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Grayson tipped his hat back, his gaze still locked on hers. Something passed between them, then unspoken but understood. Respect, recognition. And maybe something else. He gave a small nod. First light. And just like that, their course was set. Act 2. The Lonely Road. The canyon walls stretched high, jagged and weather-worn, towering like silent sentinels over the winding trail. The midday sun bore down on the rocky expanse, turning the red stone into a furnace. Heat radiated off the ground, warping the air just beyond their horses' noses. Tessa McGraw adjusted her hat, sweat sliding down the back of her neck, her focus locked on the narrow path ahead. The terrain was unforgiving. Loose gravel crunched beneath the hooves of their mounts, each step sending a soft echo bouncing between the canyon walls. It was the kind of place a man could get lost in, or worse, never come out of. Grayson rode ahead, his shoulders stiff, eyes scanning every rock and ridge as if expecting trouble at every turn. She had no doubt he was. Tessa kept her voice low. "You think they know we're coming?" Grayson didn't glance back, just kept his focus forward. Rustlers don't get this good by being careless. They'll have sentries. Her stomach tightened. Every shadowed crevice, every bend in the path felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. She wasn't the kind to let fear dictate her choices, but something about the stillness of the canyon made her skin prickle. For a long stretch, neither of them spoke. A hawk cried high above, circling lazily against the pale blue sky. The silence stretched tight between them, not quite uncomfortable, but thick with anticipation. Tessa stole a glance at Grayson Tate, noting the firm set of his jaw, the way his fingers curled loose, but ready around the reins. The man didn't let his guard down, not for a second. The weight of the day pressed down on her, heat and exhaustion setting deep in her bones. She exhaled sharply, shifting in the saddle. Without a word, Grayson reached into his saddlebag, pulled out his canteen, and held it out to her. Tessa blinked, surprised by the gesture. She wasn't used to men looking out for her leastways, not in small, quiet ways like this. She took the canteen, the warm metal cool against her fingertips. Their hands brushed in the exchange, a fleeting touch, but it sent a strange awareness skittering up her arm. She swallowed a mouthful of water, then handed it back. "Thanks." Grayson tipped his hat lower, his only response a short nod. Tessa wanted to say something, maybe tease him about finally showing a little softness, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned her attention back to the path, gripping her reins tighter. Minutes passed. Then Grayson shifted, slowing his horse. "There." His voice was barely above a breath, but the sharp edge of it snapped her to attention. Tessa followed his gaze to the ridge ahead. Through a gap between the canyon walls, a makeshift pen of horses came into view, corralled in a natural basin below. Their stolen herd. Tessa's breath hitched. Her gaze swept over the scene, at least 24 horses, penned behind rough fencing. 3 men milled about the corral, moving slow, easy. Too easy. A surge of relief rushed through her at the sight of the horses, but it was short-lived. This wasn't over. Not yet. Grayson eased his horse behind a rock outcropping, motioning for her to do the same. She followed, heart hammering. They were close now. Close enough to feel the weight of what came next. Tessa gripped the pommel of her saddle, voice low. "What's the plan?" Grayson's eyes never left the corral. "We wait." Tessa wasn't good at waiting, but looking at him now, seeing the careful calculation in his gaze, she knew this was where she had to trust him. She exhaled, steadying herself. Because one way or another they were getting their horses back. The wind kicked up a lazy swirl of dust across the canyon pass, the dry air carrying the sharp scent of sage and sun-baked earth. An old shack stood hunched against the rocks, its walls warped with age, its roof sagging from too many years under the relentless Texas sun. It looked abandoned, forgotten. Even but Grayson Tate knew better. Nothing in a place like this was ever truly abandoned. He scanned the empty doorway, every muscle in his body tense as he reined in his horse. Tessa McGraw pulled up beside him, her gaze flicking between him and the structure, sensing his unease. "You expecting trouble?" she asked. Grayson didn't look at her. "I expect someone's been here before us." The words barely left his mouth before a figure stepped into view from the shadowed doorway. Earl Simmons. Tessa let out a sharp breath. "Earl?" The rancher gave her a slow nod, his mouth pulling into a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was a wiry man, all gristle and sinew, with a face carved by too many years under the sun. The dust on his boots and the way he moved told Grayson one thing: this man had been watching them approach. "Didn't expect to see you out here, Tessa," Earl said, his voice smooth. "Your pa sent me to help?" Tessa relaxed, her posture easing. "Pa sent you?" "Sure did." Earl stepped down from the shack's stoop, dusting his hands together. "He figured you might need an extra set of eyes, and when I heard what was happening with your horses, well, I couldn't just sit back." Grayson didn't move, didn't blink, he didn't trust it. "Didn't take you for a man who got mixed up in other folks' problems," Grayson said flatly, his gaze locked on the rancher. Earl chuckled. "Usually I don't, but Bart Crowley and his crew, they've been stealing from honest men too long." He hooked his thumbs into his belt. "I got a good idea where they're holed up. I can get you close." Tessa looked between them, then to Grayson, her brows knitting. "Grayson?" He didn't answer right away. His gut told him something wasn't right, but they were running out of options. The herd was close, and if Crowley had more men coming, they didn't have time to waste. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, his gaze still locked on Earl. "You take us in," he said, voice even. "But one wrong move, and I won't think twice about putting a bullet in your back." Earl let out another chuckle, shaking his head. "Fair enough, Ranger." Tessa nudged her horse forward, her shoulders squaring as she looked at Earl. "Let's go then." Earl mounted his horse with practiced ease, turning his animal toward the narrow canyon pass ahead. Grayson followed, his hand resting near his holster. And just before Earl rode ahead, before he faced forward again, Grayson caught the quick pull of a grin on the man's face. Not friendly. Not reassuring. A knowing grin. And just like that, Grayson knew they were walking into a trap. The canyon walls rose like sentries, their jagged edges cutting into the afternoon sky. Sunlight barely reached the narrow pass, casting long shadows across the rocky trail. Every instinct Grayson Tate had screamed at him to stop, to turn back. Earl Simmons rode a few yards ahead, his shoulders too loose, his pace too easy for a man supposedly leading them into a rustler's camp. Grayson had seen this before, too many times. A setup. Tessa, unaware of the storm about to break, rode beside Grayson, her gaze scanning the cliffs. "This don't feel right," she muttered, shifting in her saddle. Grayson's hand slid to the grip of his revolver. "That's 'cause it ain't." Then it happened. Earl, without hesitation or a second glance, yanked his horse hard to the side, whistling sharp and loud. Gunfire exploded from above. The first shot ricocheted off a boulder near Grayson's shoulder. The second sent dust and rock spraying into Tessa's mare's flank. The animal screamed, rearing up, nearly throwing her. Grayson's own horse bucked in protest, but he gritted his teeth, gripping the reins and wheeling the animal behind a rocky outcrop. He had just enough time to register figures moving above them, shadows against the cliffs, barrels of rifles glinting in the sun. A perfect trap. "Tessa, get down." She fought for control of her horse, eyes wild, but before she could make it to cover, a second round of shots rang out. A bullet hit the ground near her mare's hooves, sending the animal into another violent fit. The next instant, Tessa was airborne. She crashed onto the hard, packed earth, a cry ripping from her throat as she rolled. Her mare bolted into the canyon, hooves pounding. Grayson's stomach lurched. She wasn't moving. Gunfire still rang out, bullets chipping the rocks near his head. Grayson turned, firing blindly toward the cliffs. A strangled yell told him one of the bastards had been hit, but there were too many of them. Earl had disappeared, the coward was long gone. More figures rushed in from the canyon entrance, boots kicking up dust. At least 6 men, maybe more. Bart Crowley's men. Grayson's mind worked fast. Keep fighting or grab Tessa and run. He didn't have time to choose. A rifle stock slammed into his ribs from behind. Pain shot through him, the breath knocked from his lungs. Before he could react, a second blow struck his skull. The canyon tilted. Sky, earth, sky again. His knees hit the ground. He barely registered the rough hands grabbing him, the sneering laughter of the outlaws as they yanked the gun from his fingers. His last thought before the blackness took him was of Tessa, her crumpled body in the dust, her chest rising, but barely. Then everything went dark. The cave wasn't much of a hideout. It was a narrow slit in the canyon wall, just deep enough to keep them hidden from Crowley's men. The air inside smelled of dust and damp rock, the kind of place critters took refuge in when storms rolled over the plains. Tessa sat on the ground, her back pressed against the cool stone. The ache in her arm pulsed with every heartbeat, sharp and insistent. She cradled it with her good hand, biting back a curse as she tried to adjust the makeshift bandage she'd tied around it. Grayson knelt a few feet away, his face in shadow, the dim firelight casting deep grooves in his features. He hadn't spoken much since they'd escaped, since he'd dragged her off the battlefield, barely conscious, while bullets cut the air around them, since they'd lost. Tessa yanked the cloth tighter, but her fingers fumbled, clumsy from exhaustion. Grayson's voice cut through the silence. "Let me." She hesitated, but he didn't wait for an answer. He moved in, gently prying the bloodied bandage from her grasp. His hands, rough from years of riding and fighting, were surprisingly careful as he unwound the fabric. She sucked in a breath when he touched her arm, the wound screaming in protest. His jaw ticked, but he said nothing. "You should have let me handle it," she muttered, trying to mask her discomfort. Grayson exhaled through his nose, focused on his task. "You would have made it worse." Tessa huffed, too tired to argue. But sitting still while he took care of her, it did something to her resolve. It softened the edges of her anger, made her feel vulnerable in a way she didn't like. When he was done, he sat back on his heels, studying her like he wasn't sure if she'd punch him or thank him. She chose neither. Instead, she pushed to her feet, testing her balance. She was sore all over, bruised in places she hadn't realized, but she wasn't broken. She could ride, she could fight, and yet Grayson was looking at her like she was made of glass. "I know what you're thinking," she said, brushing dirt from her trousers. His brow lifted. "Do you? You think this was my fault?" Grayson's expression darkened. "That ain't what I think." Tessa scoffed. "No. Then why do you keep looking at me like I'm something you need to protect? Like I was some helpless fool who got herself caught up in this." Grayson stood, towering over her, his posture stiff as an iron rod. "You think I wanted this?" His voice was calm, but something raw simmered beneath it. "You think I don't know how bad it went back there?" Tessa held her ground. "Then stop acting like I was the problem. We were outnumbered, Grayson. That was on them." His hands curled into fists. "I should have seen it coming." Tessa stilled. This wasn't just about tonight. There was something deeper in his voice, something heavier than regret. She studied him in the firelight, noting the tension in his shoulders, the shadow in his eyes. "What happened to you?" Grayson turned away, dragging a hand down his face. He didn't answer right away, like he was waging a private war. "Then," quieter, he said, "I led men into a job once. Good men. I thought I had it handled." His throat worked. Not all of them walked away. Tessa exhaled, understanding dawning. "That why you became a ranger?" A muscle jumped in his jaw. "That why you're so damn set on finishing this?" Grayson's gaze snapped back to her. "I ain't losing another fight." She stepped forward, heat rising in her chest. "And I ain't backing down just cause you think you gotta fix something in yourself." He looked at her, then really looked at her. She didn't see pity in his eyes or condescension. She saw fear. Not for himself. For her. And that scared her more than anything. Then his face hardened. "You're going home." The words hit her like a slap. Her breath caught. "Excuse me." Grayson turned away, grabbing his saddlebag. "Soon as it's safe, I'm putting you on a horse and sending you back to your pa." The finality in his voice sent anger surging through her veins. "The hell you are!" He didn't flinch. "You're hurt. You barely made it out last time. If I hadn't Tessa cut him off stepping in close. If you hadn't what? Saved me." She laughed. But there was no humor in it. "I saved you too, Grayson. Or did you forget that?" His jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. Tessa's chest heaved. "I'm not some burden you gotta get rid of. I can do this. I will do this." Grayson took a slow breath, his expression unreadable. Then he turned, walked to the mouth of the cave, and looked out into the night. Tessa stood there, pulse hammering. And for the first time since they'd started this chase, she realized something. She wasn't fighting Crowley's men anymore. She was fighting Grayson Tate. And she wasn't sure which battle was going to be harder. The sky was a pale wash of color, the first breath of dawn stretching across the canyon's jagged edges. The air still held the bite of night, but the promise of heat lingered just beyond the horizon. A single star remained visible, stubborn against the coming light, and Tessa McGraw knew exactly how it felt. Her horse stood saddled, reins tied loosely to a scrubby mesquite tree near the mouth of the canyon. Grayson had made sure of that before disappearing into the night, leaving her with a choice she didn't want to make. Go home like he demanded, or stay and fight for what was hers. She gritted her teeth, rubbing a hand down her face. Her arm still throbbed where she'd hit the ground during the ambush, and her muscles ached from too many days in the saddle. But the pain wasn't what twisted in her gut. It was him. His words from the night before clawed at her. "You're going home. You barely made it out last time. I ain't losing another fight." She had seen the ghosts in his eyes when he said it, the weight of whatever past mistake he carried pressing down on him like a yoke he couldn't shake. Grayson Tate had already lost someone before. He thought sending her away was the only way to keep it from happening again. And maybe it was. But Tessa knew one thing for certain. If she left now, she'd never be able to live with herself. Her pa had spent years building up that herd, working himself to the bone to make sure their family's legacy stood for something. He might have sent her after Grayson in the beginning, but that was just him protecting his only child. The truth was, those horses were as much hers as they were his, and more than that, she couldn't turn her back on Grayson either. Not when she knew he would charge forward alone, carrying all that guilt like a man resigned to his fate. Tessa let out a slow breath, her pulse steadying. She untied the reins from the mesquite and swung into the saddle. The canyon stretched ahead, vast and empty in the morning hush. A fresh set of tracks cut through the dry soil, pressed deep enough to belong to multiple riders. She knew enough about tracking to recognize they were recent, and they were heading straight for Crowley's hideout. Tessa tightened her grip on the reins. If Grayson thought he could leave her behind, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. With a nudge of her heels, she sent her horse forward, following the trail. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The ridge stretched high over the canyon, its jagged edges baking under the relentless sun. Grayson Tate crouched low, shielding his eyes as he scanned the valley below. The rustlers were there, just as he'd expected. A ragged-looking bunch, but organized too much for common thieves. Crowley had trained them well. Grayson's hand tightened around the stock of his rifle, the weight of it familiar. He had one shot at this. One chance to hit Crowley where it hurt before the man could disappear into the desert with the stolen herd. And he'd do it alone. It had to be that way. He took a slow breath, but it did nothing to ease the pressure in his chest. Too many bad memories clawed their way to the surface. Another job. Another ambush. A woman caught in the crossfire, her screams slicing through the chaos, the look of terror in her eyes when she realized she wouldn't make it out alive. Grayson had tried to save her. He'd failed. That failure had followed him ever since. And now, with Tessa McGraw too damn stubborn for her own good, he wasn't about to let history repeat itself. She was too capable, too brave, too much like the kind of woman who got herself killed when men like him made mistakes. Grayson adjusted his hat, shaking the memory loose. He focused on the scene below. The rustlers had their camp set up in the natural basin of the canyon, just beyond a series of jagged outcroppings. The stolen herd milled in a makeshift corral, some pacing, others stamping their hooves, uneasy in unfamiliar surroundings. Grayson counted 6 men in plain sight, but Crowley wouldn't be careless enough to leave himself exposed. There were more, he could feel it. He adjusted his rifle, settling into position. If he took out the sentries first, he could a sound cut through the stillness. A horse. Not from the camp below, his jaw locked. Damn it. He turned his gaze to the distant rise behind him, where the land sloped back toward the canyon entrance. A lone rider moved between the rock formations, the familiar curve of a woman in the saddle, her hat pulled low against the sun. Grayson didn't need to see her face to know. Tessa. His gut twisted, torn between anger and something he didn't want to name. The damn woman had defied him. Again, his fingers tightened around the rifle stock. She was going to be the death of him. But for reasons he didn't dare examine, he felt something else too. Relief. She was safe. For now. Grayson exhaled, turning his attention back to the canyon below. If she wouldn't leave, he'd just have to make sure this fight ended before it could get anywhere near her. The valley lay stretched below them. The stolen herd penned in makeshift corrals, their restless movements sending dust curling into the morning air. Pockets of mist clung to the lower ground, still thick from the cool night, softening the edges of the rugged terrain. But there was nothing soft about what lay ahead. Bart Crowley's men were up early, their low voices carrying through the crisp morning air. A handful of rustlers loitered near the fence line, their rifles slung lazily over their shoulders, while another 2 moved among the horses, checking the ropes and gates. From his position on the ridge, Grayson Tate had already mapped out every escape route, every potential weakness in the camp below. He could take them. He just had to be smart about it. But before he could settle on a final approach, a small sound behind him sent his instincts screaming to life. He spun, ready to draw, and Tessa McGraw stepped out from the shelter of a boulder, hands on her hips, eyes flashing with fury. Grayson let out a sharp breath, shoving his gun back into its holster before he did something foolish like shoot the one person who could make his life harder than it already was. "You got a real bad habit of sneaking up on me," he muttered. Tessa narrowed her eyes. "And you got a real bad habit of running off and thinking you can do everything alone." His jaw tightened. "Tessa, no," she snapped, closing the distance between them. "You listen to me, Tate? You don't get to decide what's too dangerous for me. These horses are mine just as much as they are my father's, and I ain't about to ride home and pretend none of this ever happened." Grayson let out a slow breath, his eyes searching hers. She was stubborn, impossible, infuriating, and she was right. With a sigh, he tipped his hat back. "You got a plan, then?" Tessa's stance softened just a fraction, her frustration giving way to determination. "Yeah, I do. You might be good at tacking down men, but I know horses." She gestured toward the valley. "We spook the herd, send him running. That many hoofs stampeding through their camp. It'll be chaos. They'll be too busy trying not to get trampled to stop us." Grayson considered it, his mind already piecing together the gaps in her idea. "And while they're busy dodging hooves, we go for Crowley." Tessa nodded. "He won't expect an attack while he's trying to control a panicked herd." Grayson couldn't argue. It was smart. Dangerous. But smart. Their eyes met, the charged air between them thick with something unspoken. Grayson swallowed. "You stay close to me. No running off, no taking chances." Tessa smirked, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Guess that means you better keep up." A ghost of a grin tugged at the corner of his mouth before he sobered. There were no guarantees, not with what they were about to do. but if this was their last chance to set things right, they'd take it together. Without another word, they turned toward the valley, moving into position. The battle was coming, and they were ready. The dust was thick in the corral, kicked up by restless hooves and the sharp scent of sweat and leather. The stolen herd milled uneasily behind a rough-hewn fence, their nervous energy pressing against the boards. Bart Crowley stood near the entrance, his stance easy, but his sharp eyes never stopped moving. He had the look of a man who thought he'd already won. He was wrong. From their position behind a rock outcropping, Tessa McGraw crouched beside Grayson Tate, her breath steady despite the hammering of her heart. Their plan had to work. There was no second chance. Grayson tipped his hat lower, eyes locked on the camp. "You ready?" Tessa's fingers curled around the coiled whip at her hip. "Born ready." Without another word, she stood in one smooth motion and cracked the whip through the air. The sound split the morning like a gunshot. The horses exploded. Hooves thundered against packed earth, the fence groaning under the weight of panicked animals. The herd surged forward, muscle and terror sending them stampeding through the heart of the outlaw camp. The rustlers never saw it coming. One man dove for cover, another spun to fire too late. A stallion barreled into him, knocking him hard to the ground before vanishing into the chaos. Tessa leaped into the fray, heart pounding as she grabbed the saddle horn of a familiar mare and swung herself up. The horse danced under her, wide-eyed but obedient to her steady grip. Grayson was already moving. He had his gun drawn. The first shot taking down an outlaw before he could raise his own weapon. Another rustler charged him from the left, but Grayson met him with the hard barrel of his revolver. A swift strike to the jaw sent the man sprawling. Dust swirled thick, the air heavy with the sound of gunfire and the wild cries of men and beasts alike. And then, through the storm of chaos, Crowley. He stood firm near the pens, his gun raised, eyes scanning the chaos like a wolf searching for weakness. His gaze locked onto Grayson, a slow, knowing smile. Grayson's grip tightened. This had been a long time coming. Crowley fired first, the bullet grazing the edge of the stall where Grayson had taken cover. Grayson rolled, coming up on one knee, returning fire. Crowley dodged, fast for a man his size, disappearing behind an overturned trough. Tessa saw it happen, saw Grayson move, saw the way Crowley positioned himself, lining up his next shot while Grayson was reloading. She didn't think, she acted. With a sharp kick, she sent her mare charging toward Crowley. His head jerked up just as she bore down on him, gun in hand. His eyes widened. He hadn't expected her. A mistake. She fired. Crowley staggered, a cry ripping from his throat as her bullet found its mark in his shoulder. Grayson was there in an instant, closing the distance. He didn't waste words. One hard punch sent Crowley crashing to the ground. Silence fell. The dust settled. The outlaws who hadn't been shot had either fled or lay groaning in the dirt. The horses had bolted into the canyon, but they were free now. Tessa slid from the saddle, breathing hard, adrenaline still thick in her blood. She turned just in time to see Grayson standing over Crowley, gun trained on him. "You're done," Grayson said, voice low, deadly. Crowley spat into the dirt, face twisted in pain. "Damn Ranger." Grayson didn't react, just reached for the cuffs at his belt. "Tessa," he called, eyes never leaving Crowley. She stepped forward. "Help me tie this bastard up," she grinned. With pleasure. And just like that, it was over. The McGraw ranch came into view, just as the sun dipped low over the horizon, painting the sky in warm hues of gold and amber. The rolling pastures stretched wide, the land familiar, welcoming. The scent of earth, of horses, of home wrapped around Tessa McGraw like a long-lost embrace. She rode at the head of the herd, her mare moving with steady confidence, ears twitching at the familiar sights and sounds. Behind her, the stolen horses, her horses moved as one, their hooves drumming against the dry earth as they recognized their land. The ranch hands waiting by the fence let out a whoop of victory, hats flying into the air, cheers ringing out as the first of the herd thundered through the gates. Tessa's chest ached pride, relief, exhaustion all twining together in a tight knot. She had done it. They had done it. Her father was already striding toward her, his boots kicking up dust as he closed the distance. Calvin McGraw wasn't a man prone to grand displays, but when she slid off her horse, he pulled her into a fierce embrace, holding on longer than usual. "You did good, girl," he said, voice gruff. Tessa's throat tightened. "You doubted me?" she teased, forcing a grin. Calvin chuckled, the sound rough but warm. "Never." Then, softer, "You got your mama's fire." The words made something twist deep inside her. She swallowed hard, nodding against his shoulder. When he pulled back, his eyes shifted past her, locking onto Grayson Tate, who had dismounted and stood a few paces away, watching the reunion with his usual unreadable expression. Calvin took him in, gaze steady. Grayson gave a short nod. Herds all accounted for. Rustlers won't be coming back. Calvin studied him a beat longer before offering his hand. Grayson clasped it without hesitation. "You've got a place here, Ranger," Calvin said. A muscle jumped in Grayson's jaw. "Not sure how long I'll be around." The words sent a cold rush through Tessa's veins. Of course, he was a ranger. Rangers didn't stay. They rode on, chased trouble, found the next fight. Tessa's stomach twisted, but she held her head high, refusing to let it show. Calvin clapped Grayson on the shoulder and stepped away, giving them space. The hands were busy tending to the herd, the yard alive with movement. But for Tessa and Grayson, everything else faded into the background. She crossed her arms, studying him. "So, that's it? Then, you just ride out?" Grayson exhaled slowly, gaze dropping for the briefest second. "I don't belong in one place, Tessa." A small, humorless smile tugged at her lips. "That what you keep telling yourself?" His eyes snapped to hers, something raw flashing across them before he masked it. Tessa stepped closer, her heart pounding. "You don't have to run anymore, Grayson." He hesitated, his hands flexing at his sides, as if fighting some internal battle. "You don't understand," he said finally, voice rough. "I lost good people because I made the wrong call once. That doesn't go away." Tessa's breath hitched. He was still carrying it. That old guilt, that fear of failing someone again. Her fingers itched to reach for him, to pull him out of that dark place. "Grayson," her voice was softer now, barely above a breath. "You didn't fail me." His jaw clenched. "And you won't," she added. "Not if you stay." Silence stretched between them, thick as the Texas summer air. Then, Grayson closed the last of the distance between them. His hand came up, rough fingers tucking a stray piece of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering. "I don't know how to stay," he admitted. A confession, low and unguarded. Tessa swallowed hard. "You don't have to do it alone," she whispered. Grayson studied her, as if weighing every battle, every reason to turn away. Then, his hand slid to her jaw, tilting her face up, and he kissed her. Not soft, not uncertain. It was heat and desperation, relief and longing all wrapped in one. Tessa sank into it, gripping the front of his shirt, anchoring herself to him. When they finally pulled apart, her chest was heaving, her heart hammering against her ribs. Grayson rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven. "Damn you, Tessa McGraw," he muttered. She grinned. "That mean you're staying?" His hands tightened around her waist. "I reckon I am." And just like that, Grayson Tate had finally found something worth fighting for. Her. The Texas sky stretched wide, washed in the deep oranges and soft pinks of a setting sun, casting long shadows across the rolling land. The heat of the day had finally relented, giving way to the cool whisper of evening. Crickets had begun their quiet symphony, blending with the distant, rhythmic sound of horses swishing their tails and shifting lazily in the corral. Tessa McGraw sat perched on the wooden fence, her booted feet dangling, her arms braced on the top rail. The land she loved spread before her, golden in the last light of day, whole again now that the stolen herd had returned. and Grayson Tate sat beside her. He didn't say much, just rested his arms against the fence, watching the horses with that quiet, steady presence she'd come to expect from him. They had won. Not just the fight, not just the herd, but something bigger. Tessa let out a slow breath, the satisfaction of it settling deep. Never thought I'd see him back home. Grayson shifted, turning his head slightly to study her. I had my doubts a time or two myself. She smirked. Liar, you don't doubt yourself. One corner of his mouth tugged up. Not when it comes to a fight. He looked back toward the corral. But this, sticking around, taking a chance on something real? That's new for me. Tessa swallowed, the meaning behind his words pressing warm against her ribs. She didn't push. Didn't rush him. Just waited. Grayson exhaled, his fingers tapping against the wood. Rangers move from town to town, job to job. Never figured I'd want anything different. Her throat tightened, but she kept her voice light. And now, his gaze met hers, steady and sure. Now, I figure Greenbrush ain't so bad. Good land. Good people. He reached out, caught the end of one of her loose auburn curls between his fingers, rubbing the silken strand absently. His voice dropped. One person in particular. Tessa's chest squeezed. The man who had spent years running from guilt, from regret, from the ghosts of his past was choosing to stay. For her. The truth of it stole her breath. She turned fully, her knee bumping against his, her hand settling over his on the fence. So that's it. You're just gonna stay put. He laced his fingers through hers, rubbing his thumb over her knuckles. That depend on you, Tessa. His voice was low, gruff. You keep me. Tessa's heart soared. A slow smile tugged at her lips. Guess that means you better keep up, Ranger. Grayson let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. Hell, woman, you've been keeping me on my toes since the day we met. And then he kissed her. It wasn't rushed, wasn't fueled by danger or desperation. It was slow, deep, lingering, the kind of kiss that spoke of home, of a promise, of forever. The sun dipped lower, the first stars appearing in the vast, endless sky. And beneath it, Tessa and Grayson stood together, ready to write their next chapter not as a lawman and a rancher's daughter, but as two souls finally at peace, finally where they belong. Together. The stars stretched endlessly over the McGraw Ranch, twinkling like lanterns scattered across an ink-black canvas. The heat of the day had faded, leaving the night air warm and easy, carrying the rich scent of hay, fresh turned earth, and the distant murmur of crickets. The land lay quiet, but something electric hummed between Tessa McGraw and Grayson Tate, something neither of them had the will or the want to fight anymore. Grayson leaned against the railing of the corral, his broad shoulders bathed in moonlight. His hat sat low over his brow, but not low enough to hide the way his gaze devoured her. Tessa stood a few feet away, barefoot in the soft grass, arms crossed, the wind teasing loose strands of her hair. She knew that look. It made her pulse leap, made heat bloom deep inside her. You keep looking at me like that, Ranger, she teased, tilting her head, and I'm liable to think you got ideas. Grayson's slow, easy smile did things to her that ought to be illegal. Darlin', I had ideas the minute I met you. She rolled her eyes, but her heart thumped hard against her ribs. He straightened, prowling toward her, his movements lazy, confident. You don't believe me? I think you're full of it, she smirked. But I'll hear you out. Grayson reached her in 2 strides, stopping so close she could feel the heat of him. His voice dropped low, like whiskey poured slow and smooth. First time I saw you standing in that barn all stubborn and determined, I thought, God help the poor fool who tries to tell this woman what to do. Tessa smirked. That poor fool turned out to be you. Grayson chuckled, his fingers brushing her wrist, trailing up her bare arm until goosebumps rose in his wake. Yeah, he admitted, voice rough, and I reckon I don't mind one bit. She shivered at his touch, at the promise in his eyes. You're a menace, she whispered, but she leaned into him anyway. Grayson's hands slid around her waist, pulling her flush against him, and you're a damn wildfire, burning up everything in your path." Tessa tipped her chin up, her breath shallow and uneven. "Then maybe you have to stop me before I set everything ablaze." His mouth curved into something wicked and knowing. "Oh, sweetheart," he lowered his head, his lips just brushing hers. "I got no intention of stopping you." And then he kissed her. It was deep, slow, claiming like he had all the time in the world to savor her. His hands roamed her back, pulling her closer, molding her to him. Tessa melted against him, lost in the taste of him, the feel of him, the pure, undeniable need simmering between them. She tangled her fingers in his hair, tugging just enough to make him groan. That sound shot straight through her, made her knees weak. Grayson must have sensed it, because he lifted her in one smooth motion, cradling her against his chest like she weighed nothing. "Grayson," she gasped. He grinned, his breath warm against her ear. "Gotta make sure my woman don't go setting fire to the whole damn ranch." Tessa laughed, but it turned into a sigh when his lips found the curve of her throat, trailing soft, open-mouthed kisses down to her shoulder. She was lost. Completely irrevocably his. And God help her, she wouldn't have it any other way. He carried her toward the house, his hold sure, possessive, and as the door swung shut behind them, Tessa knew one thing for certain: this was forever. The end.